So Mike Woodford is our presenter today, and he's going to be talking about connecting GIS, people, process, standards, and governance, and why they matter to you, and actually why they matter to all of us. Mike is the Geographic Information Officer and Chief Data Officer for the state of Idaho. And because of COVID, I've never had a chance to meet Mike face to face. We've been working together for months on a variety of issues, both members, active members, of course, of IGC and IGC-EC. And I'm very happy that Mike is with us today to share his years of experience in GIS and data management, people management, all that. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Mike.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you for for inviting me to participate today. I'm excited about this. And just kind of a disclaimer to start with for those who are attending. We're not going to be sticking to technology as the Tech Talk title would seem to indicate. So we're going to talk about, as Keith mentioned, people, processes, standards, and governance. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through kind of each one of these and make sure that we're understanding, have common definitions of what each of these mean, and then we'll start bringing them together, because all of these things very intimately tie together in order for us to create a GIS environment, to work cross-domain, to share data, and to enhance the use of GIS in those critical decision-making processes that happen at the organization level and higher. I was talking to Cy Smith, who's the GIO for Oregon, and he's involved at the federal level, and he's been that way for a long time. And he and I pretty much see eye to eye on this issue of people and processes and standards and governance as a key component for success in furthering the mission of GIS. So with that preamble, we'll just move right on here. Maybe, there we go. Okay, so we'll start this talking about GIS and PPT. And PPT stands for people, processes, and technology. And so the relationship between these three are people use process and use technology to do what they do. And process and people define, in large part, the technologies that are put in place. So this is kind of the triangle that we're going to work with. We'll expand on this a little bit as we go forward, but we'll start with people, especially GIS people. And there's two flavors of people when we talk about GIS. We have those that are producers and those that are consumers. And those producers we'll define as those, and probably most of you on this call, who are people with specialized skills in GIS and maybe many or maybe just a few years of that experience. And consumers is kind of everybody else. The stakeholders, the decision makers, the citizens that we work for. I should have put up their students, so I apologize to our educators. And those consumers give feedback to the producers in order to help them to define what the products are that they're creating, how they can better provide for the needs for those consumers. But understand that as we talk about people, people are the doers. So they do the tasks involved in processes, and they leverage technology to do that. So when we talk about people, we also have to keep in mind that there are various questions and characteristics that we have to deal with. How are they organized? What roles do they have? Are they trained? What kind of skills do they have? Who's in charge? And also, and all of you know this, we got lots of different varied personalities. We all have opinions on certain things, some strong, some weak. we're creatures of habit, and we have various motivation levels and other things. So as we deal with people and organizations, there are a few challenges. So ingrained behaviors, habits, and personal processes. I was noticing the other day, I did this little experiment, that when I eat, I follow a process. And so I consciously made an effort to change. And it was interesting that it was uncomfortable, and how ingrained and how natural that that process of eating had become. And then I noticed putting on clothing, right? Do it a certain way, and doing it differently was a little uncomfortable. So we do have these ingrained habits. We also have specific comfort zones, and there's often a fear of the unfamiliar or unknown. Within organizations and within communities, there are communication practices and different skill levels. And in organizations, there are various levels of executive support and participation, which is critical for the business processes. We're all kind of defined by our roles and how we fall into the organization charts in our various organizations. The interesting thing is that for both people and organizations, we're all really subject to this very dangerous phrase, which is, we've always done it this way. And that's what we want to kind of get beyond as we think about people, organizations, the processes that we do, and the technology that we use. All right, so let's skip ahead to process. And just as a definition, a process is something that has a defined set of steps. And if we do that process, we should end up at a particular and desired outcome or result. And we have to understand that processes are very heavily reliant on timing. And it's very difficult to look at a single process by itself because they're so interdependent. And that's important because process is what we do when we start solving a problem and moving towards some type of solution in our business and using technology. But the idea about processes is they should be repeatable. So if you have a process that's defined, anybody should be able to do that process and theoretically end up with the same result. But processes really only bring value when they're actively governed, and I like this term, and they remove the ambiguity of how people consistently utilize standards and technology to achieve a desired result. And so if we're using processes, then we really should ask some questions. And if we're not, we need to ask the questions and understand some of the characteristics and traits of what a process is. So what are processes? We need to define them. Are they accepted? Is everybody accountable to them? Do they produce reproducible results and outputs? They should be documented. They need to be reviewed and validated consistently. And good processes can be applied in and between domains. And we'll use an example of that here shortly. And then understand that people do processes. And that's a key thing to keep in mind, because we don't want to get caught in that trap of we've always done it this way. So this is a dynamic and living part of what we do. So when we talk about the integration between people and processes, people need to understand, how do I fit into that process? What's my role? And then how am I going to be measured in compliance with doing that process? What are the metrics? And who do I give feedback to in order to improve or show that that things are working the way that they're supposed to? And so people and processes are an integrated duo to produce results. So now let's skip ahead to technology. And technology is a tool. and I hope that everybody agrees with that. But it's a strong tool that helps us carry out processes. But the process has to be understood and defined first. Okay. And technology can help automate, which is really a large part of the strength of technology, but people have to be trained to use that technology or multiple technologies. Now, here's the part that I find interesting, and that is over long years being involved in IT, technology, on the technology side and on the business side, that we can't let the technology define the organization. Okay, we can't change our processes to fit the technology, and so the technology only has value when it enables and supports both standards and processes. And so when we talk about technology, we assume that processes are already defined. We're finding the technology that supports our best internal processes and procedures. And what's available? Are people trained? How do they become trained? What's the cost of ownership and the cost of engagement? Because there is a cost to both of those. Does my technology or the technologies that I'm using support the standards that we've defined or that the organization has defined as critical to their success? And does the technology improve outcomes? And the characteristics of technology, those traits that are important, should be things like the technology supports but does not drive the processes. The technology has to be appropriate for the job. But we also have to understand that there's another part of that, which that technology requires care and feeding. So there's an administrative piece that falls under technology in order to have it do what we want it to do. It also requires training and some controls put in place, like for privacy and security, for interoperability and those types of things. But also technology can add complexity. And I'm sure all of you at some point have found this to be true. And sometimes that complexity is acceptable. Other times we sometimes want to think, wow, do I want to deal with this level of complexity in order to complete this job? What's the value of that technology being applied to my problem? But also, even though it might add complexity, the question is, can it simplify and or speed up the process? Because remember, we're applying technology to defined processes to help speed them up and enable them and to enhance compliance with standards. So let's talk about standards. And a standard provides a common language and hopefully some metrics that help to measure and evaluate performance. Okay. And the really strong thing about standards is they make possible that components, systems, data, software, all the pieces and parts that come together for a product or a solution, whether it's a small internal solution or a very broad inter-domain solution, it makes possible the interoperability of those pieces. Without them, we would be struggling. So, for example, telecommunications. If every state and every country had their own standards for how they use their phone systems, how they've been developed, the standards that they use to communicate between endpoint devices like phones and cell phones and fax machines and what have you, it would be very difficult for us in Idaho to make a phone call next door to Oregon or Washington or Utah because they would have a different standard and our communications would never mesh. So that broad adoption of standards and the definition of those standards becomes very, very important. So standards, there's some key words here. Standards and consistency are very closely aligned, but standards allow us to ensure that what the things that we make, the things that we do, the services we provide, that they can be trusted, and also that they're fit for purpose. So the things that we do what we expect them to do. And that fit for purpose is an important idea. And some of you have been involved in the development of standards. I like this little comic. There's lots of competing standards out there. Just make a search for technical standards and you'll find hundreds, if not thousands of them, and a lot of them overlap. And so we all look at them and go, oh, well, we're going to make another standard, one that encompasses everything. So now instead of just 14 standards, we end up with 15 competing standards. And this has happened over and over and over again throughout the years. But standards only have value when people and processes agree to use them and to integrate them into what they do. And that integration is important, especially holding people accountable to those standards. Okay, so here's a good example. In 1949 and again in 1968 in Geneva and in Vienna, there was an international convention in each of those cases on road traffic. And these were international treaties. They were signed in the years indicated. And they were designed to help facilitate international road travel and to increase safety for those people who drive in different countries. And so they established a set of standard traffic rules, right? Rules of the road, the standards for road signage, the standards for international driver's licensing, and how do you get one? And 116 countries have signed on to these conventions, and that number is as of 2018. And here's just a brief example of the impact of setting up these standards. So here's an example of stop signs that existed prior to the International Road Traffic Convention. And you'll see some consistency in there, and you'll see some that might not make a whole lot of sense. And so after the convention, when they agreed, this is what stop signs began to look like. Now, I've lived and worked in lots of different countries around the world. And one of the things that has been beneficial for me is that whenever I'm driving in any of those countries, whether it's on the right side of the road or the left side of the road, I know what a stop sign looks like. It's usually, in almost all cases, a red octagon with a white border and white lettering, or something close. Okay. Now the odd man out here is Russia. You can see that. But that standardization now has helped to promote safety and interoperability, if you will. I'm putting air quotes up when I say that, between these domains, those domains being country borders. All right. So let's talk about consistency as related to standards, because those stop signs really brought consistency to the driving experience across the globe, at least with those countries that have signed on to the conventions. So when we talk about consistency, what do we get from consistency? We get impact on all these very important things related to data, related to products, related to GIS, wherever we go. So if we consistently apply standards and hold people accountable, this is what we get better at. Consistency also empowers interoperability, and that means we can work together, right? We can bring broad amounts of information and data and work very simply across these domains, um, and do it in a trustworthy manner. So consistency, or standards, when they're applied consistently, allow us to get a reproducible response, right, regardless of who provides that analysis. Remember, we said a few minutes ago that standards, one of the core things that standards provide us is processes allow us to reproduce results, right? But that depends on the standards that are employed and how consistently they're engaged. So this helps ensure that the data mean what they're supposed to mean in all the use cases that we might use them. So consistency in standards drives that interoperability, there's that word again, the reproducibility of results, trust, and reduces confusion. Okay? And we can use the example of stop signs in this instance as well. Reduces confusion, it standardizes interoperability and trust wherever a person might drive. Okay, so now we've got kind of these core components, but now what do we do with them? How do we manage them? How do we control them? And that's where governance comes in. And governance is just as it says, it's the act of governing. And so it's a system where we exercise control and direction and structure, hopefully through some level of policy-driven practices, to enable consistency of, and I like this term, enables consistency and discipline of methods and practices. So it's an organizing framework or an organizational framework that addresses and manages and gives permission for strategy, objectives, standards, processes, policies, and I think most importantly, accountability. But governance must be intentional. And I've seen many examples of unintentional governance, and it doesn't work because as standards change, as people kind of do what they want to without thought for the broader picture, then that governance is waffly too. It's soft. And so governance has to be intentional when we approach it. And I like this definition. It establishes the authority and controls for how people, processes, and technology, right, that PPT triangle, are expected to behave with respect to each other, and most importantly, to achieve the mission of the enterprise. Whether that enterprise is your individual organizations, whether it's a broader group of similar types of organizations, or the state, or the country, or the world. But governance only has value with the active participation of the governed. And that's true for any type of governance, whether it be governing a city, a county, a state, a nation, what have you. All right, so let's tie all this together. So why do we need governance? Okay, well, the core to all of this is people. And each organization, or groups of organizations, or enterprises have a defined mission and vision. And that mission and vision require people in order to carry them out. And so when we employ governance to those groups of people and what they do, governance then helps to drive and inform standards and processes. And I should have drawn an arrow between standards and processes because they're intimately linked. So think of this as a column with standards and business in that same column. They go hand in hand. Now, those standards and business processes define what technologies we use. And I've deliberately shown it this way because technology should not define our standards or our processes. Technology is a tool. Pushing the button helps you get your job done, but that should be part of a business process that helps you get to what you're trying to produce, the service you're trying to provide, etc. So if we put all these three together, what we end up with is reproducible results. We get very high quality and trustworthy products. And we start to get innovation developing because we have consistency and coordination and all of these things that come together, right? People, governance, standards, technologies, processes that give us something that that maybe we haven't thought of before. So we can open our minds and extend and expand along with doing our day-to-day work. Okay, so how does this map into what we're talking about today? My scope of work is the state of Idaho. And so I call this GIS United. And so as I look at this diagram and I start putting these pieces together, we've got a GIS strategic plan for the state. That's our mission and our vision for GIS. And it's not just for state agencies, but for, hopefully, we'll get adoption by counties and cities, educational institutions, tribal nations, even industry could participate in this. We have in place already governing bodies. So we've got the IGC and the IGCEC, which are core governing bodies for the state of Idaho. And underneath the IGCEC, we've got the technical working groups that help to provide governance and control. And then we've got the Office of the GIO, which we're still figuring out how that works. And the technical working groups are tasked with developing and defining those standards. What are the standards that we want everybody to adhere to across the state that will enable us to be interoperable, be able to share data, to do all these kinds of things? And those are approved by the ITA, which is a statutory organization for technology within the state. The businesses define what their processes are, but the technical working groups can help them define what those processes are in order to comply with those standards. We have technology that is already in place for the most part. Most people use Esri products. There are others out there. And those all go together to provide private, if it's just for your organization, private shareable between a group of organizations, and also public products, data, and that data being authoritative, which is highly critical, especially to making sure that the decisions that come from those products are accurate. And then it also helps provide a state work framework or the data sets for the statewide framework, and for what we call TIM, the Idaho map. All right, so people, process, standards, and governance. Again, people use technology and processes. Processes and people help define what the technology should be. We have standards that are supported and implemented with through process and with technology. And then overlaying the whole thing, we've got this idea of governance that allows us to control and to standardize and be consistent across the whole enterprise. So in your organization, if you look at the triangle here, the PPT triangle, that if we implement them correctly, then we end up having very, very high value products and services from our organizations. In the state of Idaho, this is our vision, that we implement people, process, technology, standards, and governance to get to data sets that are shareable, interoperable, authoritative, and we can create that Idaho map that we all hope we could have at some time in the future. So I'm going to end there, and appreciate you listening. And any questions?